very good morning and thank you so much for joining us on Media Monitor as we give you analysis on the stories that kept us talking this week. I'm your host, Alicia Jali. Coming up on today's show, what does the recent outcry by journalists say about the state of our local media? How far can artists stretch their freedom of expression? While we zoom into the controversial painting that depicts President Jacob Zuma in a compromising position with Atul Gupta. We also look at how far we've come as a country in the fight against HIV/AIDS. And lastly, Khotso Mokoena will chat to us about his participation in this year's Olympic Games. But first up, as always, at 9 a.m., a very quick run through the news headlines. Renewed fighting in South Sudan that has claimed more than 300 lives is set to dominate the African Union summit, which opens today in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. A new player on the political scene is taking up the cudgels on behalf of the poor. The Khoisan Revolution has unveiled its manifesto in Uppington in the Northern Cape. And in your sports news, some good news there where the Bulls ended their Super Rugby season with a 43-17 bonus point victory over the Cheetahs at the Free State Stadium out in Bloemfontein yesterday. I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by political analyst Professor Stephen Friedman, as well as social commentator Mr. Shani Mokari. It's been a while. Gentlemen, a very good morning to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Morning. Thank you for inviting us.
All right, we're going to get into your hashtag very quickly. But first up, we want to have a look at what made us talk on social as well as digital media. And undeniably was, of course, that artist Ayanda Mabulu's painting, which caused quite a stir this week with his latest work, which depicts President Jacob Zuma in a compromising position with one of the Gupta brothers. We are discussing this story later on in the show, but a very quick review of some of the tweets that came through. Ayanda Mabulu says, Zuma's crimes made me paint it. Mkululek Omoyo says, see it, hashtag Ayanda Mabulu or Ed Zapiro, artistic satire and provocation can't be policed. We have to set our emotions aside. It is democracy at work. Last but not least on this topic, Zuma Mkolisi says the art of hashtag Ayanda Mabulu portrait of hashtag Zuma isn't a bad thing. It's just that many take the bullet for Zuma, but the freedom allows him openly. Let's have a look at more digital news that kept people talking this week. The very controversial lady there, Lerato Chabalala, who caused another stir on Twitter with her book, The Way I See It, The Musings of a Black Woman in the Rainbow Nation. And it comes with its own warning there, saying that it is guaranteed to offend. And she says there, and here it is, The Way I See It will be available at all major bookstores. But these are what people said after going through some of the reviews of her book. But hashtag Lerato Chabalala is lazy, dishonest, and failed to provide the service that she promised. This is not a book. Where is the book? Bonga Dlulane says Lerato Chabalala's knew exactly what she was doing with that book. Seek relevance in whatever way possible when no one is talking about you. Gentlemen, what did you think of this? Shoni, let's start with you.
Well, the word really on the straight about the book is that this is a book about somebody who really doesn't have the understanding of the average South African in terms of how they experience, they go through their, their lives, and so it's very narrow. It's a very narrow view of the average black South African's life in this country. So I can understand the controversy in a sense.
Professor, what did you make of it? I know you saw some.
There's a sort of irony about this in the sense that, look, social media themselves, we tend to forget. I mean, yes, they're very important mode of communication for some people, but about 80% of South Africans are not on social media. So you have the 20% who are on social media looking at a particular individual who indeed is not really in touch with the experiences in the life of the vast majority of South Africans. The unfortunate impression is created that the book was written mainly to draw attention to the author. And for reasons one understands, people are reacting very negatively. It doesn't really take racism in this country seriously, and racism is very much part of most South Africans' experience. So, yeah, I understand the reaction. But one wonders what, the reaction might even be more hostile if the majority of South South Africans who are able to read this book.
That means I've actually been out there and actually gotten a copy of that book. Let's look at other news that caught our digital and social media attention was, of course, the Juba, the capital of South Sudan, with the renewed fighting. Of course, UNICEF, they're tweeting, we are providing urgent aid to thousands that have been displaced by the recent fighting in Juba. And Kenya Airways, hello, flights to Juba have now resumed. How may we assist you? Gentlemen, now we are, the AU is going to discuss the infighting in South Sudan. But in terms of social media, look at this picture. How do you think this relays the message of what is currently happening on the ground, Prof?
Well, I think it does relay part of what is happening on the ground, because what we often tend to forget in these situations when you interview the political leadership is that this is affecting the lives of of people who are not trying to gain power, they're trying to get on with their lives. And I think it is very important to humanize this. On the other hand, you can't just reduce political conflicts to the human dimension. We have to look at why this happened. It raises unfortunate questions about and one understands there was an independence movement, etc. But it raises unfortunate questions about building states when there's no resources. You start off this familiar story, you have no infrastructure, and it becomes unfortunately inevitable that politicians start to fight about the little that there is. In South Sudan, it was made worse by the fact that the leader of the independence movement, who was in a sense the man who was holding the whole thing together, John Garang, passed away before independence, and that left a leadership vacuum. So it's a distressing story, but the hope is that if you look at the human angle, there will be pressure on the political leadership to talk to each other and at least end the violence. You know
what surprises me is that the uprisings in Zimbabwe are actually not, and it has been confirmed, they're not on the AU summit agenda. But this was another trending story on social media, and it was dubbed hashtag this flag Mugabe Vets SRC. They're saying the wheels of change are turning. Hashtag Tajamuka. We are awake. Hashtag this flag. And there's a picture. They're saying we are not the West, the East. We are citizens. Hashtag Tajamuka. Hashtag this flag. And Trevor Ngube says, of course, he's relaying the message on that picture there. And of course, Doug Coltert says changes or charges have been dropped against Pastor Evan. He is free. Praise God for answered prayers. Shani, what did you think about this story?
Well, for a number of years now, everybody kind of knew that things were not well in Zimbabwe, and obviously we can attest to that because we have more than 4 million people, Zimbabweans living in South Africa, according to many statistics. So this kind of, for the first time, we're seeing the story from the people on the ground rather than analysts and other commentators. So it was interesting to see that finally we're getting to see what people on the ground are actually saying about what's happening to their own country.
Pastor Evans leading that movement and getting arrested for it, Professor?
I think what's interesting about it, yes, he was also released. So
yes, he was on a technicality, should I add.
What is interesting about this is that the Zimbabwean story for a long time has been framed purely in terms of ZANU-PF and the MDC.
Yes.
People said some years ago, correctly in my view, that this was ignoring citizens' organizations in Zimbabwe who have also been a very important part of the story. And what, from this vantage point at any rate, what we're seeing now is a citizens' movement. And I think that that's very important. It first of all makes it more difficult for the government to say, well, look, this is just a bunch of
And you just spoke about
politics.
independence movement on the other topic, Prof.
And, secondly, it seems, I think that, my sense is a lot of Zimbabweans, for reasons one understands, are cynical about politicians at the moment. But when you have a churchman, somebody in society, then I think people react more warmly. So I think that this could be a significant movement. One doesn't know how organized it is, but it's certainly showing that yes, Zimbabwean society is not happy and needs to be listened to.
Let's take a look at more news that kept us very busy on social media. How could you have missed this story? The biggest news of the week, second female British Prime Minister Theresa May. And of course, Marv there looking at the tweet says, by 2017, 3 of the G8 leaders will be women. Angela Merkel, who's currently the German Chancellor, Theresa May, of course, the incumbent Prime Minister, British Prime Minister, and of course, Hillary Clinton, who's touted to be the next USA president. And the cryptic Wolf says there, isn't it odd the world politics follows the Game of Thrones pattern where women seem to take the lead? Angela Merkel, Theresa May, as well as Hillary Clinton. Prof?
I think what's being missed here is, people get terribly excited about women leaders. They don't ask the obvious question.
Which is?
Are they actually advancing women's interests? So you have a whole performance about Theresa May, etc. She's got, I think, the same or slightly less women in her cabinet than Cameron had, I don't think anybody seriously regards Hillary Clinton as a fighter for women's rights, etc. So you have this irony where particularly Theresa May, a lot of their policy positions are very hostile to gay people, hostile to women, etc. Yeah. So I think that really the debate about women in politics ought to be about who is advancing the interests of women in politics. Obviously, it would be better for women to advance the interests, but we need to look not only at whether leaders are women, but whether they're women who are in touch with concerns of other women. And I don't think any of those three really necessarily pass the test.
Professor always brings a new perspective into any argument. Shani, what do you think about that argument, though?
Well, for me, I actually think it's sad that in this day and age, this is actually making news. We should have had this many, many years ago, and not just in the West, but in countries around the world.
Absolutely.
So it's sad that we've made progress in terms of more women leaders around the world at such a slow pace, and hence this is actually a front page. And by the way, I think with the Hillary situation, it's not really a foregone conclusion. The latest state says they're virtually neck and neck with Donald Trump. So there's another issue for you to think about.
All right. And of course, more news that were shocking and were trending highly on social media were the Nice attacks. And of course, the rumors there, terrorist gunman killed 80 people and wounded scores when he drove a heavy truck at high speed into a crowd watching Bastille Day fireworks in the French Riviera city of Nice late Thursday. Nico Minde says a horrific attack in Nice, France, on a day that the French were celebrating equality, liberty and fraternity. And of course, the next tweet there says horrible news of Nice attacks. Why is it always the innocent people who pay the price for the bigger and dirtier politics? Gentlemen.
Well, the coverage of this story for me was, first, it was... everybody, when the story came out, everybody immediately blamed ISIS and jihadists and Islamic fundamentalists and everybody else in that crowd. And then later on, there was an interview with the sister of the person who drove the truck that he was actually mentally unstable.
Yes.
So
apparently he was drunk and he smokes and all those things came up.
Absolutely. And it's quite possible that ISIS is actually taking advantage of the situation and said, yeah, he's one of us. So I think...
You see, I agree entirely, and I'm interested. There seems to be a very interesting... ISIS and the French police reinforce each other. Because, you see, for 2 or 3 days, there's no evidence that this man is politically motivated at all. Suddenly, ISIS claim responsibility. And they always claim responsibility. The obvious question is, why did it take them 3 days to answer responsibility? The cynical answer is that perhaps their internet feed was down and it took them 3 days to read the newspapers and find out that it had happened. The French police then announced that they've got all sorts of links with jihadists, etc. The bottom line here is that if the French police say that the jihadists were involved, they must prosecute them and the evidence must be produced in open court. Otherwise, it becomes a sense of the knee-jerk reaction whenever an outrage like this happens is to say that it's Islamists. The problem is that doesn't make it easier for the 99.9% of Muslim people who do not kill innocent civilians. So it's very important in these situations that we are guided by the evidence, not by the speculation which blames people without producing evidence.
And on that note, what do you think about the Turkey coup?
Well, the Turkey coup definitely happened. Politically motivated, yeah. Look, I think what is interesting, and people, one doesn't want to be too optimistic about things like this, but if you know the history of Turkey, this is the first time, the coups are not uncommon in Turkey. This is the first time in which the entire political spectrum, from the government through to the Kurdish people who are taking up arms, have said, look, we don't want military coups. This is unacceptable. People went into the streets. Parliament had a session in which the entire opposition backed the government on at least the coup issue. And I think it may be a turning point in history. I think it may be, in a country that's had many military coups, this may finally send a signal that this is the last one. Because, of course, the reason this was possible is that the military itself was divided. provided. This wasn't the whole military. This was a section of the military. It's a bit, once again, it's a bit dodgy about who it was, because the Turkish government always likes to blame its current enemy for everything, and they're blaming Gulen, who's an exiled religious figure, without any evidence. But the most important part of this is that Turkish society has said no more coups, and I think that's a step.
Johnny, what was your reading into this?
Well, also I was encouraged by the fact that people themselves actually went out and faced the military without guns, or and said,
They said
we
it's
will
been a
not
long
have
time
this.
coming now.
And so I'm hoping that this is something that all the would-be dictators out there are taking note and watching, that what people are sick and tired of this sort of thing, and they won't let it happen on their watch.
Let's wrap this on a positive note. No, Professor, you wanted to speak about Free State Stars, that debacle. Do tell us what you think about that
I don't think
saga.
it is positive. I think it's very sad that you have a situation in which a football team, yes, a football team a lot of people love, but the bottom line is it came bottom of the National First Division, was going down to the third tier, and then a group of people buy out a club, so there's no more club in that area of Free State, which is a problem, because we've got lots of clubs in Gauteng, so the people of Free State are deprived of top-flight football, not because their side wasn't good enough, but because their side hasn't got enough money. And I think that that's very sad, because you want a situation in which people feel that their teams are in or where they are because of their ability, not because of who's got money.
All right, well, that's how we wrap up all the digital news here on Media Monitor. A very quick break and more after that.
I've witnessed hundreds and thousands of times people who die of hunger, people who cannot grow, children who cannot grow because of hunger. In this continent of ours, 43% of kids are stunted, which means they will never reach their full potential because they didn't have the right food and the right nutrients. This is the reality which moves me to support this initiative.
It's important for us to be involved because we are born in Madiba's era, and this is Mandela Month, and the SABC's theme this month is Be More Madiba. And what better way to be more Madiba than to pack meals for children that were so close to his heart.
And we're back with your favorite Sunday morning show now. The Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, ICASA, on Monday ruled that the SABC should uplift its ban of broadcasting violent visuals. The public broadcaster is, however, set to appeal this ruling. Meanwhile, there are growing voices about the freedom of media practitioners in their workplaces. Now, this comes after some of SABC as well as ENCA staff have raised some grievances about the employers, ranging from dictatorship, racism, as well as the absence of staff unions, among other things. In our neighboring Lesotho, the editor of the Lesotho Times was shot at his home, allegedly after being interrogated by police over recent stories on his paper. All right, gentlemen, what do you think about this? I mean, media freedom has hogged the headlines. Let's dig into some of the cries that really have stood out for you, particularly this week. Prof, let's start with you.
Yeah, Alicia, I think, look, the biggest problem at the moment, quite frankly, is at the SABC. And the reason the biggest problem is at the SABC is that you have a situation in which senior journalists feel that they're not being able to do their job, and those journalists are being subject to disciplinary inquiries. Now that creates two problems. The first problem it creates is that it damages the credibility of the broadcaster, because people say, well, if you take action against journalists, then we can't take you seriously. But equally important, it's a problem for every journalist who's stood at the SABC, because people say to you, well, why aren't you being subjected to does that mean you're not an independent journalist? So I think it is a crisis. I think it's a crisis particularly because this is our public broadcaster and we want it to serve the entire population. Of course, you put it in a wider context. The wider context is important. There's unhappiness at ENCA, and that's important because it's a national broadcaster. You didn't mention there's also unhappiness at ANN7 with people being subject to prosecution. I think the difference between the SABC and the other at this stage is that you have this problem of people being actually disciplined. And that really undermines the profession, because then the impression is created that you're only doing your craft if somebody gives you permission to do it. That doesn't minimize what's happened on other channels, but I think it creates a very difficult situation for journalists and for the public.
Johnny?
Mine really is a general comment in that because of the role of media in society, from a corporate governance and ethical standpoint, they have to hold themselves to a higher standard. Imagine having a pastor who doesn't practice what he preaches. So to me, I hope they're suitably embarrassed by what happened in the past few days, both at SABC and ENCA and all the other newsrooms, because if we're going to rely on our newsrooms, our media houses, to be the shining light, and yet they are not behaving anywhere near exemplary conduct, then this is very, very disturbing.
So I think that's a very important point there. And the point is this, that when we talk about media freedom, you talk about this dreadful incident where somebody was killed in Lesotho. Yes. We tend very often to only talk about media freedom, which is something about the relationship between media and the government, or media about people outside the media who are trying to restrict the media. What we need to remember in all these cases is that sadly it is very often the people in charge of media houses who are the problem, because they don't respect their journalists enough, they don't allow their journalists. And that's a common theme in all three of our national broadcasters at the moment. In all three of our national broadcasters, journalists are saying in different ways, you're not allowing us to do our jobs. And I think that that's a very important part of the whole media freedom space.
I mean, on that point, Professor, how do we then go about in opening those relevant debates pertaining to these matters in an ethical manner? That's going to actually...
I think that, look, the fact that this is out there in the public is tremendously important. The fact that we're debating what happens at ENCA and at the SABC and at ANN7. But I think that reinforces the point that I made earlier. If you discipline people in this way, then it creates the impression that you're not addressing the issue. You're not allowing people to talk about it. Yes, you can make an argument that people shouldn't be nasty about their own company, etc. But these are not ordinary companies. These are broadcasters, and whether they're public or private, they have a responsibility to the people of South Africa, and we need open debate. So I think it's a very serious problem if you start, whether you're ENCA, SABC or ANN7, when you start disciplining journalists for speaking their minds, I think you're on a very dangerous path.
Where do we take these debates then, Shomi?
Well, I think first we need to understand that media houses are like any other organization. So the employee dynamics will happen in any other, in the newsrooms.
That was going to be my next point,
yes. They happen in any other organization. So we need to understand, if you look at the ENCA story, which around the Duke and so on, and some suggestion of racism and so on. if you've lived in this country all your life and kind of assume that somehow the past did not affect you or the way the country was run did not affect you, then you're lying to yourselves. And often those behaviors will be transferred, or rather will find their ways playing out in different organizations, the way that we've seen them play out in different organizations, at least to the extent that the race allegations are concerned.
You know, I think we also need to bear in mind, you say it's an employee-employee relationship. I mean, in this country, employees have a right to go to their employer and raise concerns, whether they are street sweepers or journalists. And I think that's another very important part of it, which has come up in the ENCA context, etc. Why do we have a situation in some cases where other workers are allowed to raise their concerns with their employers, but journalists are not? So at the very least, journalists are entitled to the same rights as other working people.
What do you say then to those that say that some journalists are only seeking relevance by pushing their own certain agendas when it comes to those issues, Shani?
Well,
it's a tough one.
Journalists are people, and to some degree they'll be affected by things that happen around them, and their perspectives are obviously affected by their worldview. So I'm not convinced, however, that journalists go into their job particularly to promote a particular agenda. I have not come across one like that. I'll be very hesitant to make that kind of.
But remember also, as a journalist, you're only credible if the people you're talking to regard you as credible.
True.
If you're not credible, people, we were talking in another context about the Lorata Chabalala book.
Yes.
People don't regard that as credible. If you're a journalist who's seen to be simply saying what some politician tells you to say.
But what makes then a journalist credible in our country?
I think if people, and I think what is interesting about a lot of what is happening in the media at the moment is that people are drawing a distinction between the journalists and the people they report to. And they're saying, in the main, there are obviously exceptions. We believe these journalists are doing their job, but we want them to be allowed to do their job. Now, that's a judgment people make. You don't make that about every journalist. I mean, those of us who consume news, etc., you know pretty quickly whether a journalist is on the level or not. And I think people are capable of making up their own minds on that.
Gentlemen, look, media plays a very vital role in our country and worldwide, but how important is it then for press freedom and also while abiding to the proper journalistic code of conduct? Let's weigh the two scenarios.
Well, the code of conduct is there to make sure that journalists behave ethically. The code of conduct is not there to make sure that journalists do what the people who employ them tell them to do. The code of conduct is really a contract, if you like, between the journalist and the public. And that is very important because
it's like a policeman and his duties.
Well, except that it's got to be out there in public. It's applied by it's applied by independent authorities. What happens is in public. I think that's the point I'm really making is that there are checks in the society to make sure that journalism is responsible. Remember, we also have the law.
Yes.
If you defame somebody in public, they can sue you and there are consequences. So I don't think that we really need to worry terribly much about, as long as people are pursuing their craft, as long as the issues they raise are relevant to the future of journalism, I don't think that should be restricted in any way.
Let's hear what people are saying on social media. The other point of reference there, Professor, at SA Media Monitor, Nomtombo, says journalists are supposed to report news as they happen without fear or favor. It's not fair to put them in a tight spot. I write what I like, says at SA Media Monitor. Some at hashtag ENCA journalists have spoken out on censorship and abuse within ENCA, yet nobody is doing anything about it. Hashtag SABC News. Brent says at SABC COO, real leaders don't lead with fear, intimidation and threats. And of course, Martin Musungu says, last but not least, I regard my employer as a worker. Our relation must be professional, working to improve a company as well as our lives. Well, we're going to take a quick ad break. We'll be back with more. And when we come back, we're going to ask how far then can we stretch that media freedom of expression? We'll be back shortly after this.
Mr. Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. We have pre-embedded educational content for free for the consumer via the Khan Academy. We've also had negotiations and discussions with the network operators to be able to give this data free. So in other words, people are able to learn on these phones for free.
Welcome back. The depiction of President Jacob Zuma in an arguably compromising position with Atul Gupta by artist and Mabulu has caused quite a stir in all media platforms. The ANC has reacted strongly to the painting, which is currently being exhibited at the Constitution Hill in Johannesburg. But the defined artist stands by his art. The painting is interpreted as a reaction to the alleged influence the Gupta brothers have on the president. Gentlemen, I mean, the big question here has been, where does one draw the line when creating art? Very, very quickly. Shani, let's start with you.
Well, I really think if there's the message has relevance, then you know, yes, artists should be allowed to depict it in a obviously in the manner that they see fit. You know, I'm kind of tempted to say tasteful, but then that's probably irrelevant in the world of art. But quite frankly, if the message has relevance, and I think this message had relevance, given what's been happening around the president and the Gupta family, I think he was well within his rights.
Prof, what do you think?
Look, I think the issue here is to a certain extent personal taste. You know, one person's crusading bravery is another person's bad taste, etc. So I certainly don't think we need to control artistic expression in the society. I mean, we're seeing with this particular issue, there are opinions on both sides, and that is healthy. We all have our personal green lines that we don't want crossed, etc. And I would have to say that given the nature of our society, to me, and that's the way I always look at these things, the question is this racist? Because a lot of, we've had, and we've talked about this on this show before, certain cartoonists who think they're being very brave by depicting black people in ways which I find offensive. So to me personally, as long as the artist is not racist, which this artist clearly is not, he might be all sorts of other things, but that's not what he is, then it doesn't worry me. But inevitably, there are going to be people who it does worry, and I think those people who it does worry should accept that next week there'll be a piece of art which they like and which worries somebody else.
Look, let's stretch on that point. I mean, the word freedom of expression came up a lot in relation to this picture, and as well as other paintings by Mabulu, but we just spoke about media freedom as well as ethics. How do we then conjoin the two there? Shani?
Well, it's a difficult one.
Relevance.
But the other thing is, let's look at the people who are, being depicted in those. These are people who are public figures. So, in my view,
do those people not have rights?
They do have rights, but nobody puts a gun on your head and say, "Thou shall be president." You know, as much as you might say people have voted and they put me there, you have the right to say, "No, I don't want to be on the spotlight." So, in a way, you're actually opening yourself up to the kind of criticism and those kind of, not necessarily those kind of division, but a number of scrutiny that might come your way, essentially.
Look, I think public figures do have less rights than others in the sense that if you put yourself out there, I didn't say no rights, I said less rights than others. I mean, if you start digging into the life of a private citizen whose decisions affect nobody, I think that is a slightly different matter from holding up to scrutiny, whoever the person is, somebody whose decisions does affect people. But that said, yes, of course public figures have rights, but in this society, those rights are protected by the law. If you feel you've been defamed by somebody, you can go to court. We even have, and that's controversial to some people, on our statute books, we have something called crimen injuria, which means that if you think that you are personally harmed by something somebody said about you, you can take legal action. So it's not as if we don't have legal protections. I mean, if somebody is really behaving in an irresponsible way, I think the other thing we need to bear in mind about ethics is that it is relevant whether the person has power over other people, okay? Because otherwise, It's a capacity to be able to hurt other people. So when we look at ethics, we need to look, is somebody exercising power over another person in an immoral way?
Gentlemen, I mean, I know we touched on it a little bit. I mean, let's liken or compare this to some of Zapiro's cartoons that have received similar or worse reviews. I mean, this is currently showing at Constitution Hill, and it is available across all media spheres. Even your children probably have seen it, Shani.
Well, I think I will go on to the professor's point that first, the person being depicted in a particular way, is it somebody in a position of, the person who's doing the depicting, is it somebody who's in the position of power who could be accused of racism and all those other things, and so on. And Zapiro is in a slightly different position to Mabula, unfortunately. But that's not to say that his message doesn't have relevance, as I said earlier, and that he's necessarily racist. So one just has to see, really how far should one go. I understand that he sort of came close in one of his pictures, or rather cartoons, to apologizing, but I'm not sure if he went all the way. But
he did apologize.
Look, I would defend Zapiro's right to draw those cartoons, but this is a democratic society, and I'm entitled to say in public that I think that they are racist cartoons. I think that what he is doing is that he is expressing the prejudices of a section of the society. He makes it appear very brave, but it's not brave at all, because in the circles he mixes, this is what everybody says. And I don't enjoy that. That doesn't mean I'm going to affect, that doesn't mean that I think he should be banned or he should be closed down. And I have a lot of sympathy with the many South Africans who look at these cartoons, black South Africans, and say, you're attacking me. I think they're entitled to say that. But it gets back to what we were saying earlier. It gets sorted out in the public debate. And there are a lot of voices out there who are taking the position I would take on Zapiro, and I think that that's very important.
I mean, Shani, I'm very interested in your point of relevance there. I mean, maybe expand to us what you mean that if, somebody can, of course, depict whatever they want to depict, if it is relevant. Relevant to who? Because we have opposing sides, opposing views, and as we saw, there were mixed reviews when it came to this painting.
Obviously, I mean, I don't think a lot of those cartoons are neutral. I mean, they're saying they're propagating a particular viewpoint, or rather advancing a particular viewpoint. So the issue of relevance, is it something that people should engage in terms of some type of public discourse or and so on. So not so much that are they right or are they wrong, but is it something that is of national interest or of interest to a large section of our population? Is it worth talking about, rather than just taking, as the professor said, a private citizen and then you splash them all over the front pages of the newspapers? So I mean, relevance in that sense, that is it something of national interest? Yeah.
What do you think, Prof?
I think that is relevant. I mean, as an example, I don't want to mention names, etc. I mean, an academic colleague of mine a couple of years ago, because of a particular legal proceeding. I mean, there were sort of articles all over the place about his personal finances, etc. I mean, that's not of national interest, quite frankly. But, if you're dealing with a public figure who is subject to criticism, I mean, whatever you think of that cartoon, the cartoon of the president and the Guptas, I mean, it's clearly about an issue of public concern. You can argue about whether he did it in a tasteful way, but I don't think there's any serious argument about whether cartoonists and artists are allowed to talk about things like this. Of course they are.
Speaking of opposing views, here's MacGyver on social media. They're on our Twitter feed saying, this is very embarrassing to the country and shows no respect. People must respect the president like other countries did. John Elton says, I stand behind the artist. His reasons for the painting is sound. I don't condone the visuals though. But then what is he saying there? Nomtomboi says, I support the freedom of speech, but I think Mabulu has crossed the line with this latest article or rather painting. It is vulgar and it's definitely not art. And Busi J, last but not least, says in other countries he will be in jail for insulting the head of state. Well, we live in a democratic republic of South Africa, and apparently this is part of the things that you can do in terms of freedom of expression. We'll have more media monitor shortly after this. Do stay with us.
The Peace and Security Council have been seized with the matter of South Sudan, and there are recommendations that come from the Peace and Security itself, where we belong to, but also from the Executive Council, which has been escalated to the heads. But what is good about the AU is that we sit down and discuss all these issues that affect us.
Welcome back now. Tomorrow, the world will convene in Durban for the 4-day International AIDS Conference under the theme Access, Equity, Rights Now. The last time the conference was held in the country was 16 years ago. And although the country still battles with high HIV rates, some great strides have been recorded since then. But here's more on this clip. All right, we don't seem to have a clip there, but we now cross and, of course, welcome Professor Abdul Karim from the Center for the AIDS Program of Research in South Africa. Now, he's one of the people who actually participated on the very same conference 16 years ago. Prof, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us here on Media Monitor.
Thank you very much. A very good morning.
Professor, I think, big news. It is the 21st International AIDS Conference. Talk to us about what we can expect from this gathering.
Well, when we think back to 16 years ago, when we hosted the conference in Durban in 2000, we had a completely different epidemic. At that stage, treatment had become available in the wealthy countries, but was not available in South Africa. We were dealing with denialism in our own government. We were seeing, thousands upon thousands of deaths, and we were in a situation that needed some drastic action. And the conference provided it. The conference created an opportunity for people to come together, people from all walks of life, and to have some kind of common consensus that it is unacceptable for the situation to continue where you will die because you cannot afford treatment. And so the AIDS conference in 2000 changed the world by making treatment available. It led eventually to the Global Fund, PEPFAR, UNITAID, and a whole range of mechanisms for wealthy countries to provide funding so that poor countries could get treatment. Today, 16 years later, we have a very different epidemic. We now have 17 million people on treatment. We are making huge strides in terms of where the epidemic is going to. We don't see those deaths anymore. However, we have a new challenge. And that challenge is that if we are really going to end the HIV epidemic, as is the global goal, we are going to have to do better in preventing HIV. We are going to have to stop the spread of HIV from continuing.
Thank you, Prof. Gentlemen, what do you think about this? I mean, years later, after the pandemic was declared, but various prevention and even maintenance measures have been introduced, but we're still dealing with the stigma as well as denial phases. How are we going to try and move this agenda forward? And I'm going to pose that question back to the Professor, but let's hear you, Professor Friedman.
Well, I think the important point here, as Professor Karim has said, we're dealing with a very different environment. That doesn't mean that we're dealing with a trivial problem. But I mean, besides the points he made about the international environment, the South African response to HIV today is unrecognizable compared to the response at the time the first Durban conference had. And that hopefully gives us a platform to work from. So it really surely makes a great difference if one is trying to deal with a scourge like this from a fairly united position, in which nobody's questioning whether this is a problem at all. You don't have the denialism he talked about. I think it should capacitate us more. Obviously, the danger at this stage is complacency, that people feel that the problem is solved, which it isn't. But I think we're in a much better state to tackle this than we were 16 years ago.
Shani?
Absolutely, and just to take on further where Professor Karim left off, that yes, we are winning the war, but sadly, there are still new infections that are happening. Yes, at a slower rate, but the fact that we still have new infections, particularly from among the youth as well, is actually quite sad and really disturbing. At this point in time, we should have gotten to a point where infections are close to zero, and we're not there yet.
Professor Karim, I mean, when it comes to issues pertaining to funding for research programs, as well as prevention, the stigma, managing the disease, what kind of solutions will be tabled at this conference in particular?
Well, I think the first issue is that we need to acknowledge that we have a problem, and we need to understand the nature of the problem. And put very simply, in 2015, globally, there were 2.1 million new HIV infections. That number was exactly the same as what we saw in 2014. So we have not been able to decrease the number of infections in the world. And when you think about it, when you sort of reflect on 2.1 million new infections, the enormity of that number, indicates the enormity of the challenge. So it's not like we don't know what to do about HIV. The evidence is substantial, but the will and the ability to do what is needed, especially at a time when, globally there are financial constraints, that's what presents a challenge. And for me, if we think about South Africa, and if we think about Southern and Eastern Africa more broadly, 70% of the global HIV epidemic is in that region. So Southern and Eastern Africa, 70% of all HIV infections. Who is most affected in that region? It's young girls. Young girls have the highest rates of HIV infection. They carry a disproportionate burden of HIV. And unfortunately, we are still lacking the full array of tools that we need to impact on that group. So we need more research, we need to roll out treatment, we need to do our best in terms of the tools that we have already for prevention. But at the end of the day, we have to be focusing on that group at some level. In terms of research, we've been very fortunate that there's been very substantial international funding available for research, principally from the US government, from philanthropy. And when we think about the situation within South Africa, the funding that is available for AIDS research is substantially better today than it was 16 years ago.
Okay.
But even then, it's a minuscule amount compared to what is actually spent on research. So the US government spends about 5 times more than the South African government on AIDS research in South Africa.
Professor, look, I'm going to have to cut you there. I know you're very passionate about this topic, and of course, I know we will be covering the conference as SABC News. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning. That is Professor Atul Karim. He is joining us from our Durban studios. A very quick ad break. We're back with Jody Hendricks shortly after that. Do stay with us.
Back in 2004, 70,000 babies were born HIV positive each year. Today, the figure is down to less than 6,000 because of a very successful PMTCT program, prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Back in 2002, there were 410,000 deaths of HIV and AIDS. according to UNH Spectrum report. But today they've fallen down to 180,000. So when you look at those figures, you realize that we are really heading somewhere.
Don't fear. The ANC fears nothing. We did not fear the apartheid machinery. Strong as it was, we faced it and defeated it. And even now, we are going to win elections with a huge majority. You must know that we cannot all be leaders at one day. Some will be leaders. At times, those who will be leaders would not be as good as those who are not leaders. But ANC is going to live for many, many years to come.
Welcome back. Well, it's all systems go for the SA Olympics team. This week, SASCOC announced its final squad of 137 athletes that will be flying the national flag high in Rio. And of course, one of the favorites in the hashtag Team SA is Mr. Khotso Mokoena, who's on the line with us. Khotso, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Media Monitor.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Look, Khotso, first of all, congratulations on your selection. Now, this will be your 4th Olympics. How does it feel?
It feels wonderful. You know, I think I still have the same feeling that I had when I went to my first Olympic Games back in 2004. So it's a great privilege.
And what can we expect from you? A gold? Are you bringing home that gold?
I think at this time, you know, one would want to do the best that they can, and then obviously, if one is able to produce the PRs, then you know that. I'm in a good position to be in the top 4 or top 3.
Thank you so much. That is Khotso Mokoena. Khotso, the whole of South Africa is behind you. We will be watching and we are praying that you bring back that gold. He was joining us on the line and he is going to Rio. We now have Mr. Jody Hendricks also on the panel. Jody, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, what do you make of the latest team? We've got quite a strong one and some bragging rights there as well.
I think if we look at the of South Africa's history at the Olympic Games, this is probably the strongest team we've ever sent. And if we look at how we've performed in the past, I think we can safely say this will be our best Olympics yet. We've got some phenomenal athletes who will be participating. If you look just back to Friday night in Monaco, Wade van die Kerk in the 400 meters and Caster Semenya grabbing gold in the 800 meters, so they're peaking at the right time. I expect her to bring back 2 medals actually in the 800 and the 400. And you know, if athletes seem to peak at the right time, and that's for me a positive. Lots of medal hopefuls, and I think 2016, will probably be Team South Africa's best performance at the Olympic Games.
What do you think, gentlemen, very quickly?
No, I think that sounds right. I mean, you know, Van der Kerk looks impossible to beat. Caster Semenya is doing so well that they're pointing fingers at her.
Unbeatable.
It does look very good. I mean, hopefully this won't be one of those great South African things where we get excited beforehand and disappointed afterwards. But I think we have reason for. I think Jodie's right. I think if our chances of doing a lot better than in the past look very good this time.
But Jodie, I want you to speak on a very important issue that also came up: the serious stance on doping, specifically in relation to a discus thrower there, Victor Hogan, who was omitted from the team. What does this say for future participants in the athletics world?
That they need to be careful. Victor did really well this year, and everybody was thinking he was going to be a medal hopeful, and he got dropped the last minute. I see that he's appealing his ban now, so I don't know, but I think doping is definitely needs to be taken seriously by the athletes, because it can mess up your whole career if you're tested positive. I mean, here was a young discus thrower who had the opportunity to go and represent his country at Olympic Games and be a medal hopeful, and now it's not even on the plane. So I think athletes need to take it seriously, because there will be consequences like we've seen now.
Shani?
No, absolutely. I mean, you have some promising young stars, and just...
It would be a shame to see them miss the Olympics just because of issues like that.
Absolutely. But just going back into like our team as a whole, I think I was very encouraged to see the National Lotteries Commission sort of advance somewhere, I think, in the region of 70 million to back our athletes. And so, you know, they've got the country behind them, they've got the money now, and hopefully they'll bring back the gold.
I wanted to ask Jody that as well. I mean, Jody, the cash injection, does it alleviate a lot of stress from the players in terms of the fact that they get better training? What happens really when they get such a huge cash injection?
Well, there's a program called the OPEX program that SASCO runs, where they look after our elite athletes. That would be the likes of Wade van die Kerk, Caster Semenya, where they get given a salary to sustain a lifestyle so that they don't need to work. I think where the problem comes in is with the smaller federations or the smaller sport in South Africa, where you don't necessarily see all the cash filtering down to those athletes, where they can, you know, focus on their sport 100% and not still have to work and do their sport as well.
All right. Anything that you want to add there, Prof, before we go?
Well, before we get too upset, I mean, the drug thing is very important. Bear in mind that an entire country may not be going to the Olympics. Russia may not be going at all because of the state-sponsored doping program. So hopefully we're not going in that direction.
I mean, what about the Zika fears? Was that any concern, Jody?
I think the golfers and some of the tennis players, I see Simona Halep also pulled out yesterday. I think it's an excuse because if Usain Bolt says, I'm going to go and I'm going to represent my country and hopefully bring back a medal, I don't see why other athletes, world athletes, are not doing the same. Maybe the Olympics are not important to them. The Zika virus, I think the world's going to go to Rio, and I think they should have everything in place to ensure the athlete safety.
Jody, thank you so much. They're kicking us out of studio. Shani, Professor, thank you so much for your presence and input this morning. And to you, thank you so much for watching our show, Media Monitor. We hope that you will join us again next week, same time and place, right here on SABC News. From me, Alicia Jali, and the rest of the team, have a great day and goodbye.